Morning, Abisola. So we thought it would be good to catch up this morning just about the strike action and that's been happening and that's been announced recently. So what's it all about?
So there are two separate grounds on which the strike action is happening, and the first relates to pensions, so the USS pension scheme, and proposed reductions to member benefits and increased contributions for both employees and employers. And there have also been disagreements around the way that the scheme has been valued. And then the second ground for the industrial action relates to what is referred to as the four fights. And you might remember that is a continuation of industrial action that also happened in 2019 and 2020. And the four fights relate to pay offers, gender and minority ethnic pay gaps, staff workload, and then the use of casual contracts, so whether that's fixed term contracts or contracts that are dependent on funding. With that in mind, what is the current position, Siân?
So following UCU reballoting for action, they've now got mandates for action, for strike action and also action for short of a strike at 68 universities. And so there's action which is happened last week, and that was 5 days of strike action from the 14th to the 18th, so Monday to Friday last week, and that was for 44 universities, and that related to the pension dispute that you've just mentioned, so the USS pension dispute. And then there's 2 days of actions this week, so the 21st and the 22nd, and there's 68 universities, so the full amount of universities that got mandate for action, and that's in respect to both the USS pension dispute but also the pay dispute that you've referred to. And then finally, the third period of action is 3 days of actions, which is proposed the 28th of February, the 1st and 2nd of March. And that's 39 universities have got mandate for action for them. And that's just in relation to the pay dispute. And some have got notices of ballots for action for short of a strike. So that could include refusing to undertake particular teaching. It could be boycotting assessments and refusing to mark. It could be working to rules, so only sticking to contractual hours, not working beyond that. And so it's important to have a think about, and universities are starting to think about, and we're talking to universities about what they can do to mitigate the impact of this action. So what are your thoughts around that, Abisola?
Well, as you'll know, industrial action and the legal consequences and considerations arising from that is a really complex area. And it's one that does need careful thought in terms of any action or any steps that universities are proposing to take. An important base rule is that where there is lawful industrial action, so presuming that the union has followed all of the required steps in terms of balloting, etc., in the circumstances where the industrial action is lawful, then employees shouldn't be dismissed or subjected to a detriment for participating in that strike action. That said, there are steps that universities can take in response to strike action, and one of those that I'm sure that all universities are currently considering is in relation to pay, because universities are entitled to withhold all or part of an employee's pay if, as a result of their participation in the strike action, they're in breach of their employment contract. So in circumstances where employees are taking part in strike action, then universities can deduct pay for the days that the employee is striking. Now, that in itself is quite a complicated area in terms of how you determine what the amount of a day's pay is, and there have been a number of cases which consider that particular issue, particularly whether you deduct 1/260th or 1/365th of an employee's pay, and it depends ultimately on the type of contract that the employee is engaged in. So yeah, lots to consider there. And even taking it beyond that, if we're talking about action short of a strike, because what I was just referring to was in relation to strike action, but action short of a strike is a bit more complex, isn't it, in terms of what steps the employer can take in relation to pay?
Yeah, it is a bit more complicated, and I think if it's action short of a strike, then universities really need to consider whether they're willing to accept partial performance of the contract, or actually say that it's breach of contract, which they're entitled to do, and that partial performance isn't accepted. And if they decide that they're going to refuse partial performance of any sort, then they need to explicitly state that actually will not accept partial performance. And I know that's what UCIA is stating at the moment. And then if that's the position, then they don't need to pay for any work that the employee does. And it's important that they explicitly state that any work that an employee does will be on a voluntary basis and therefore will be unpaid if that's the position that they're going to take. And it's worth repeating that statement and repeating that position, particularly given that this is ongoing action, and there might be further mandates for further action as well. And it's important to consider that actually, as a result of making that decision to refuse partial performance, it is effectively a lockout, even if you're not physically preventing individuals from coming to work and doing their work, which we wouldn't recommend, then there are implications for locking out employees and saying that you're not going to accept partial performance, which need to be considered. And then the other alternative is that you do accept partial performance. And then it's slightly more complicated in terms of it being a question of degree, really. And so in terms of that and the pay element, and how would it work in terms of deducting pay if you were willing to accept partial performance?
So again, it's a complicated area. I mean, if a university is refusing to accept partial performance at all, then it is entitled to deduct full pay. Again, bearing in mind the really important points that you've made about being clear that partial performance isn't being accepted. An alternative approach that some universities might take is to ascertain what proportion of the service hasn't been carried out and to deduct a partial amount of pay to reflect that. Now, I make that sound more straightforward than it is, because of course it's not necessarily going to be kind of straightforward or clear as to how you calculate that. There was one case, for example, where there was a teacher who refused to take on 5 more pupils, which would have taken his class to 36 pupils. So the employer in that case decided to reduce pay by 5/36. And you can see how the employer calculated that. It won't always be that straightforward. It may be that you're trying to quantify the amount of time that an employee would otherwise be working, but hasn't as a result of partial performance. But again, it's not necessarily easy to quantify that. And in some senses, I think it's perhaps easier for an employer to have a clear stance that it's not accepting partial performance and to therefore refuse to pay on that basis, so that you've got a clear understanding and basis on which that has been determined. So you're either deducting full pay or accepting partial performance and paying as normal in those circumstances. I mean, I know that we've talked a lot about the complexities around industrial action and the fact that it's not always straightforward. What are the risks that universities need to be aware of in trying to navigate this area?
I think you're right in terms of actually the complexity, particularly if you're going down accepting some partial performance and trying to quantify that. We don't perhaps have the straightforward situation of the number of pupils that in that case. And so there is risk around that if you are deducting pay on a non-all or nothing basis. But there's no right to bring a claim for an employee for unlawful deductions if the reason for the deduction is them taking lawful industrial action. So they'd need to bring a claim in the civil courts or in the employment tribunal after their employment had finished and ended. But I think what's more important, perhaps more significant a risk, is really the longer term impact on industrial relations. It could result in further action and escalate the issue if it's provocative in terms of deductions of pay. Particularly, the third element really is the press coverage that's we've already seen in relation to the position that's been taken in relation to deduction pay, let alone the industrial action itself, which got press coverage prior to that. So there's lots of things to consider. There's lots of things that we're discussing with universities and that we can advise on, aren't there, that around this issue as the industrial action progresses. So it's good to talk to you about it today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.